All right, so today what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking at the kidney and doing kidney dissection. So first thing I want you to notice is I've got one kidney here that's already cut and I have another one that I still need to cut. So when we look at the outside of the kidney, we have something called the fibrous capsule or the renal capsule. And what that is it's a fibrous connective tissue, which you can see on this side, has been kind of removed slightly. So that fibrous capsule, what it's doing is it's actually protecting the kidney from infection. So remember that your kidney is in your kind of like lower back region, and so it's in your abdominal cavity, and it's retroperitoneal, which means it's behind that peritoneum of the abdominal cavity. But your kidney is prone to infection, so we're going to have this fibrous capsule to basically protect the kidney from infection. And the reason being is because your kidney is filtering blood. If an infection gets into the kidney, it has access to your blood, and then that infection can actually go throughout the entire body once it gets into the blood. So that's kind of the important part there, is having this fibrous capsule to make sure that we don't spread infection to the kidney. On the hilum here, this little indentation here on the medial side, so our kidneys are actually going to sit like this. This would be somebody's right kidney, and the other one would be sitting like this. And so on this indentation, we have basically three structures that are leaving. We have this long, slender structure, very, very long. It's kind of yellowish in color. That is the ureter. The ureter on this side here. It's this long one. And then we have two blood vessels. We have this longer one on this kidney, and then this slightly shorter one over here. And on this one here, the two blood vessels are actually kind of wrapped together in connective tissue, so you can kind of see that where they split right here in between where my finger's poking through. So to tell the difference between the renal artery and the renal vein, remember that your arteries have thicker walls. So when I'm feeling these two, I'm feeling for the thickness of the wall, and this one here is the artery, where this one here is the vein. So the renal artery is supplying blood to the kidney, and then the renal vein is the one that's draining the kidney of the blood. So what I want to do is I want to actually go through and dissect this kidney, and then we'll actually take a look at the inside part. So whenever you dissect, you kind of want to do as centrally located of a cut as you can. So I put the hilum facing down and then make my incisions. So on the preserved kidneys are much, much tougher tissue. In actual fresh kidneys, every once in a while we'll actually dissect deer kidneys. The tissue is much, much softer. So when we open up the kidney here, you're not going to see all the tubes that you would in this one here. So we're gonna have to do a little more dissecting. But the first thing that you'll see immediately is that you basically have two regions of tissue. You have this outer region here, which is right underneath the capsule. Can't really see it on this kidney well, but this lighter region here is the cortex, and kind of this darker region here is the medulla. So remember, cortex always refers to the outer region, medulla always toward the center region. So same thing on this kidney here. You can see kind of the lighter region here, which is that cortex, and over here is going to be the medulla. So in the cortex, we're going to have a lot of blood. A lot of our filtering occurs in the cortex. So the functional and structural unit of the kidney is the nephron, and the nephron is actually what's filtering your blood and creating urine. The thing about it is that they are microscopic, so when we actually dissect the kidney, we won't see them unless we take a sample and stick it underneath a microscope. So we have two types of nephrons. We have cortical nephrons. The cortical nephrons are located completely in the cortex, and then we have the juxtamedullary nephrons. Juxtamedullary basically indicates that you're going to have a part of it that is in the medulla, so they are both in the cortex and the medulla, and the part of them that is in the medulla is something known as the loop of Henle, or the nephron loop, which we'll talk about when we get into the nephrons in lecture. So once again, two different types of nephrons. Cortical is in the cortex, and then our juxtamedullary are between the cortex and the medulla, so there's parts in both. So those are the two major regions, our cortex and medulla, but we do have a third region of the kidney, and on this side you're actually going to see it a little bit better. So you kind of see this tube here that's kind of like a funnel shape, so it's kind of wider here and then it narrows to get to the ureter. This is the renal pelvis. So when we look at the kidney, we're going to see the cortex, the medulla, and the renal pelvis, which are basically three major parts. So within the kidney, and we'll actually be able to see it better on this one here, the cortex is just where kind of our nephrons are located, but then we have these renal pyramids. So if you look, you can kind of see these striated regions right here. Those are the pyramids, and they look like a pyramid. They're kind of wider toward the cortex, and they kind of funnel down into the medulla. And so when we actually look at more of a dissected kidney here, you can see that striation really well. That is the renal pyramid. That's part of the medulla. And in between the renal pyramids, which we see here and here, we're going to have renal columns. So the columns are going to separate the renal pyramids. And those are the two major regions of the medulla, is the pyramids and the columns. So you'll actually see that we have some tubes here, and you don't really see them on this dissected kidney. But if you kind of start pulling at the tissue, you actually see that you'll notice that there's some areas that are going to pop out a little bit more easily. And so what I'm doing is I'm just going to remove some of that tissue so I can actually see that tube there. So that tube there, if we're continuing to do this, we can kind of pull back on that, and some of those are going to start popping out a little bit more. I can feel one over here. So I'm basically kind of ripping some of those pyramids apart to get to those tubes, and you can see major tube in that hole there. So what that'll eventually look like, if I continue with that, is it's going to look like these tubes. So once again, we've got our cortex on the outside, we have our medulla, and so the medulla once again is made up of the renal pyramids here, which are the striated regions, and then the columns. So the renal pyramids are actually draining those nephrons that are creating that urine, and from the renal pyramids they're going to go to the tip of the renal pyramids, which are called the renal papilla. From there they're going to go into a series of tubes. These smaller tubes are called minor calyces. Minor calyx is just the singular form of it. Those minor calyces are then going to drain into the major calyx or major calyces, and then from there they're going to drain into that funnel-shaped region. You can see it really well here. You can see it's kind of wider here toward the medulla, and then it kind of funnels in toward that hilum. So that's the renal pelvis right there, and that's going to go into the ureter, which we see here, and it's covered with a lot of fat here. So once again, we start with basically producing that urine in the nephrons, which remember some of them are in the cortex strictly, some of them are in the cortex and the medulla. They're going to go through the collecting ducts, which are in the renal pyramids. The renal pyramids are going to drain into the renal papilla, which is just the tip of those renal pyramids, into the first set of tubes, which are the minor calyces. From the minor calyces, they'll go into the major calyx. From the major calyx, they'll go into the renal pelvis, and from the renal pelvis, they'll go to the ureter. Remember, when it goes from the ureter, it's going to go into the bladder for temporary storage, and then once we are in the bladder, when it's appropriate, you can then urinate by releasing that urine from your bladder and going and moving it into the urethra.